One temple made the headlines, the others quietly made history. Abu Simbel is the temple everyone talks about. But what most people don't know is that it was only one part of a massive rescue operation. The UNESCO World Heritage Site, known as the Nubian Monuments, from Abu Simbel to Philae, includes 5 temples that were physically moved, stone by stone, to escape the rising waters of Lake Nasser. And beyond those, it also protects tombs, quarries, a monastery, and even a centuries-old cemetery, sites that weren't relocated, but still reveal the many layers of Egypt's past. This is how ancient monuments were lifted, literally, to survive. Southern Egypt, that's where it all begins. The Nubian monuments from Abu Simbel to Philae follow the Nile along the stretch between the Sudanese border and the city of Aswan. Most travelers start from Aswan itself, a city well connected by daily flights from Cairo, and the gateway to one of the most ambitious heritage rescue missions in history. In the 1960s, Egypt set out to control the Nile once and for all. The Aswan High Dam would stop the floods, generate electricity, and reshape the country's future. But to do that, Lake Nasser had to be created, flooding hundreds of kilometers of southern land right through ancient Nubia. That meant temples, not scattered ruins, but monumental structures carved into cliffs or built on islands. Temples raised by pharaohs like Ramses II, dedicated to gods like Isis, or covered in some of the finest carvings of the New Kingdom. And all of it was about to vanish underwater. With time running out, Egypt made an appeal, and for once, the world answered. Under UNESCO's coordination, engineers, archaeologists, and dozens of nations came together for a rescue effort unlike anything seen before. Some sites couldn't be saved, too remote, too fragile, or already lost. But 5 were chosen. 5 temples that could still be moved and were considered too important to let go. Abu Simbel, Philae, Amada, Wadi es-Sebua, and Kalabsha. Each one posed a different challenge. Some had to be cut into hundreds of massive blocks. Others were lifted whole or reassembled in new landscapes that mimicked the originals. And all of them were racing the rising water. That rescue didn't just save monuments. It redefined how the world thinks about heritage. And that's where this story begins. Abu Simbel sits near the southern edge of Egypt, just 40 kilometers from the Sudanese border and about 280 kilometers from Aswan. Isolated in the desert, it faces Lake Nasser today. But that wasn't always the case. The temples were built over 3,000 years ago by Ramses II. And he didn't build it to impress the locals. He built it on the southern frontier, deep in Nubia, as a warning to anyone coming from the south. Egypt rules here. The main temple was aligned so that twice a year, sunlight would pierce the sanctuary and light up the seated gods inside, all except Ptah, god of the underworld, who stayed in the shadows. A second, smaller temple stood nearby, dedicated to Queen Nefertari. One of the few in Egypt where a queen appears as tall and central as the pharaoh himself. Ramses wanted the world to remember her too. When plans for the Aswan High Dam were announced, Abu Simbel became one of the biggest concerns. The temples weren't just important, they were huge, carved directly into rock, and sat right in the middle of the planned flood zone. Letting them drown wasn't an option. But saving them? That was a challenge no one had faced before. Engineers and archaeologists from across the world joined forces. The solution they came up with was bold: cut the entire site into blocks, over 1,000 pieces, move it up the hill, and rebuild it exactly as it was. But this wasn't just a matter of stacking stones. Each block, some weighing up to 30 tons, had to be carefully mapped, numbered, and sliced along natural joints to preserve the integrity of the carvings. Workers dug around the temples to isolate them from the cliff, then used cranes, rails, and pulleys to transport the pieces 65 meters higher and 200 meters inland, where an artificial hill had been sculpted to recreate the original setting. To move the blocks safely across uneven terrain, engineers built a custom transport system right on site. Steel rails were laid through the desert, allowing massive stone sections to be slid on wheeled platforms with the help of cranes and hydraulic jacks. Each piece had to arrive in the correct sequence, like assembling a 3D puzzle where nothing could be forced or misaligned. Some blocks were lifted vertically, others rotated in mid-air to fit into storage or staging areas. The heat, dust, and remoteness made every step more difficult. In some cases, protective molds were applied around delicate carvings to prevent damage during transport. Even the interior chambers were reconstructed with the same orientation and light shafts, preserving the solar alignment that illuminates Ramses II's statue twice a year. Nothing was left to chance. Engineers simulated the entire process with scale models before touching the actual monument. It was archaeology, architecture, and logistics working at full scale, in full speed. The relocation took about 4 years and involved experts from countries like Italy, Germany, and the United States. It was one of the largest archaeological rescue operations in history, and it worked. At the time, no one had ever attempted anything like it. The scale of the project and the precision it demanded turned Abu Simbel into a global symbol of what could be achieved when science, culture, and international cooperation aligned. The operation cost tens of millions of dollars, most of it raised through UNESCO's campaign, with support from over 50 countries. Documentaries were filmed, reports circulated in multiple languages, and engineers treated the site not just as an excavation, but as a legacy to be preserved for generations. And when the final block was set in place, it wasn't just a technical success. It was proof that heritage could be protected, even under impossible odds. Today, visitors can walk through the same colossi that once stood by the Nile, now overlooking the lake that nearly erased them. The temples are intact, open to the public, and still powerful. Though the setting has changed, the feeling they inspire hasn't. Just a few kilometers south of Aswan, on a small island in the Nile, stands the Temple of Philae. Today, it's one of the most visited sites in Upper Egypt. Philae was once located on a nearby island that now sits underwater. The temple complex, built mainly during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, was dedicated to the goddess Isis and became one of the last active centers of ancient Egyptian religion. Worship continued there well into the Christian era, making it a rare blend of traditions, with later chapels and Coptic crosses carved into its walls. When the first Aswan Dam was completed in the early 20th century, the temple began to flood seasonally. By the time the high dam was planned, Philae was already partially submerged for much of the year. If nothing was done, the rising waters would make the island disappear completely. The rescue was complex. The original island was surrounded by a watertight wall, and the water had to be pumped out before the structure could even be dismantled. Then, each block, over 40,000 of them, was carefully numbered and moved to nearby Agilkia Island, a higher, safer location that had been reshaped to resemble the original site. The work was led by Egyptian engineers, with technical support from Italian and West German teams. It took years of work, but the result was striking. Today, the temple stands almost exactly as it did before, its columns reflected in the calm waters around it, boats arriving just as they would have in ancient times. Visitors walk through its courtyards, trace the reliefs of Isis and Osiris, and watch the light and sound shows that animate its history each evening. Philae may have changed islands, but it hasn't lost its place in Egypt's story. The Temple of Amada is the oldest of the monuments rescued from the flood, older even than Abu Simbel. It stands on the shores of Lake Nasser, about 180 kilometers south of Aswan, far from the crowds and cruise ships. Its remote location means fewer visitors, but also a quieter, more intimate glimpse into ancient Egypt. Built during the 18th dynasty, under pharaohs Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, Amada wasn't about grandeur. From the outside, it's modest, no towering statues or dramatic facades. But inside, the walls are filled with some of the finest and most vivid painted reliefs from the New Kingdom. They show pharaohs making offerings, battles against foreign enemies, and royal decrees etched in stone. When the flooding of Nubia became imminent, Amada was identified as a site worth saving, not for its size, but for the quality of its artwork and the temple's age. It was small enough to move, but too fragile to cut into blocks like Abu Simbel. So a different approach was used. The entire structure was moved in one piece. French and Egyptian engineers reinforced the temple with a steel framework, then carefully lifted and transported it 2.5 kilometers inland, to a site above the new flood level. The operation lasted several months and required slow, controlled movement over specially prepared tracks. Along with Amada, the nearby Temple of Dur and the Tomb of Penut were also relocated to the same area, forming a small cluster of rescued heritage in the middle of the desert. Today, the Temple of Amada still feels off the beaten path. Further north along Lake Nasser lies Wadi es-Sebua, once a sacred road lined with sphinxes, now one of the most impressive temple sites saved from the flood. It sits about 150 kilometers south of Aswan, and like Amada, remains far from the main tourist circuits, quiet, remote, and powerful in its silence. The main temple here was built by Ramses II and dedicated to Amun and Ra-Horakhti. It was designed to impress: colossal statues, towering pylons, and a long avenue flanked by carved sphinxes that gave the site its name, Valley of the Lions. Unlike some temples that were carved into cliffs, Wadi es-Sebua was built in open space, making it slightly easier to relocate, but no less urgent. When the rescue campaign began, Wadi es-Sebua was one of the first selected. Its scale, state of preservation, and connection to Ramses II made it an obvious choice. But the site included more than just one structure. Nearby stood the smaller Temple of Dhaka and the Temple of Maharaka, each with their own stories and architectural details. All three were carefully dismantled and reassembled together on a higher plateau, not far from their original location. Egyptian and Polish teams collaborated to dismantle the temple and move it roughly 4 kilometers west to a higher location in New Wadi es-Sebua. The move took over a year. The goal was not just to move the buildings, but to recreate the setting, retaining the alignment, orientation, and even the feeling of approaching the temple through the desert. Today, visitors who make the journey are rewarded with a remarkably intact site. The last of the 5 is the Temple of Kalabsha, located just a few kilometers south of the Aswan High Dam. Unlike the others, it wasn't moved far. In fact, it now sits on the western shore of Lake Nasser, directly across from the dam that nearly submerged it. Kalabsha was originally built during the Roman period, around the 1st century CE, under Emperor Augustus. It was dedicated to the Nubian god Mandulus, and although built late in Egypt's ancient timeline, the temple followed many of the same architectural traditions: massive gateways, spacious courtyards, and well-preserved carvings that show both Roman and Egyptian elements side by side. Because of its solid construction and relatively accessible location, Kalabsha was one of the first temples relocated during the rescue campaign. The rescue effort was led by West German engineers, who worked with Egyptian teams to cut the temple into over 13,000 blocks, and served as an early test for techniques that would later be used on more complex sites like Abu Simbel. The operation included not only the temple itself, but also 2 smaller monuments nearby: the Kiosk of Kertasi and the Temple of Beit el-Wali. Together, they form a compact cluster of monuments on the lake's edge, easy to access, and often the first stop for travelers arriving in the area. Today, Kalabsha still feels like a frontier temple. Its carvings remain sharp, its walls sturdy, and its view over Lake Nasser striking. Elephantine sits right in the middle of the Nile, across from modern-day Aswan. It was once one of the most important places in all of southern Egypt. People have lived here since at least the 3rd millennium BCE. That's older than the pyramids. Back then, Elephantine was Egypt's southern frontier. It marked the edge of pharaonic control, and beyond it lay Nubia, sometimes a trade partner, sometimes an enemy. The island became both a border post and a bridge between worlds. It wasn't just a military outpost. Elephantine grew into a full settlement, with houses, storage facilities, temples, and markets. By the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, it was home to governors known as the chiefs of the southern border. These were powerful figures. They weren't just local administrators. They represented the king in a frontier zone that needed both diplomacy and defense. In some periods, they even led expeditions into Nubia or managed gold mining routes in the desert. Religiously, the island was sacred. It was believed to be the home of Khnum, the ram-headed god who controlled the Nile's waters. His temples stood here for centuries, rebuilt again and again by different rulers, from pharaohs like Senusret III to Roman emperors like Augustus. In fact, Roman influence is everywhere on the island. Many of the surviving structures date from the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. Columns with Greek inscriptions, gateways added by emperors. There's no clean break between Egyptian and Roman here. At its peak, Elephantine may have housed a few thousand residents. It was a busy, multicultural town, especially during the New Kingdom and into the Greco-Roman era. Traders, priests, scribes, soldiers, they all passed through. Papyrus documents found on site show daily life, grain deliveries, land disputes, letters between merchants. There was even a Jewish garrison stationed on the island during the Persian period, complete with their own temple. That alone tells you how layered this place is. And despite all that history, it never vanished. Today, parts of the ancient town are still being excavated. Visitors can walk through the ruins, mud brick houses, granaries, temple walls, and trace the outline of a community that lasted for more than 3,000 years. The Nilometer is still there too, carved into a stone staircase that once measured the river's rise. Pharaohs depended on it. Farmers planned their seasons around it. Elephantine wasn't built to impress like Abu Simbel or Philae. It wasn't covered in colossal statues, but it lasted. Just north of Elephantine, carved into the cliffs overlooking the Nile, lie the tombs of some of the most powerful men of southern Egypt. They're not the kind of place that draws crowds like Abu Simbel or Philae. There are no grand facades or polished stone columns. But if you want to understand how Upper Egypt worked during the Old and Middle Kingdoms, this is where to look. These tombs belong to local governors, men who ruled the region when the pharaoh was far away in Memphis or later in Thebes. Back then, Aswan wasn't just the edge of Egypt. It was a frontline post, and whoever held power here had to manage trade routes, deal with Nubian neighbors, and keep the southern border stable. These governors were part military leader, part diplomat, part priest. Their influence was local, but their status was national. Most of the tombs were cut during the 6th dynasty, around 2300 BCE, and then again during the Middle Kingdom, roughly 500 years later. The style changes between periods, but the idea stays the same. Carve into the hill, decorate the walls with scenes of daily life, offerings, hunting, and in some cases, long autobiographical texts. One of the most famous tombs, that of Harkhuf, tells the story of an expedition into Nubia to bring back exotic goods and a dancing dwarf for the pharaoh's entertainment. That letter from the king to Harkhuf, carved right into the wall, is still there. Another standout is the tomb of Serenput II from the Middle Kingdom. It's larger and more refined, with columns inside and vivid reliefs showing Serenput with family, servants, and offerings. These weren't modest burials. They were designed to project authority and to make sure the deceased were remembered. The tombs are cut deep into the rock, aligned to face the Nile. Today, they sit quietly above the city, reached by a path that winds up the cliff. There are no lights, no barriers, no gift shops. Just ancient chambers, open to the air. Their carvings worn but still legible. They may not be as grand as the pyramids or as polished as the temples, but the Old and Middle Kingdom tombs in Aswan give something else. A glimpse into the lives of real people. Not far from the modern streets of Aswan, the landscape shifts. Flat ground gives way to cracked granite and half-carved stone. This is where some of ancient Egypt's largest monuments began, the stone quarries of Aswan. For over 3,000 years, this was Egypt's main source of red and pink granite. Pharaohs ordered statues, sarcophagi, columns, and obelisks to be carved from these rocks and shipped down the Nile to temples across the country. If you've seen an obelisk in Luxor, Karnak, or even in Rome or Paris, it likely started here. The most famous example is the unfinished obelisk. Still lying in the quarry, it was meant to be the tallest ever made, nearly 42 meters high. But somewhere during the process, a crack formed in the stone. The work stopped, and the monument was never completed. That mistake is what preserved it. And today, it's one of the best insights into how these giant monuments were actually made. The obelisk was carved directly from the bedrock. Workers used dolerite-pounding stones to chip away narrow trenches around it. You can still see the marks, thousands of them, etched into the sides. No high-tech tools, no cranes. This wasn't a one-off. The area is full of unfinished pieces, tool marks, half-formed statues, and rough-cut blocks that were never completed. Today, visitors can walk through the quarry site and stand beside the unfinished obelisk. High above the west bank of the Nile, across from Elephantine and just beyond the tombs of the nobles, stand the quiet remains of the Monastery of St. Simeon. It dates back to the 7th century CE, though some parts may be older. Originally dedicated to Anbahadra, a Coptic bishop who gave up his position to live as a hermit, the site later became known as St. Simeon. It quickly grew into one of the largest Christian monasteries in Egypt, housing dozens, maybe even hundreds of monks who lived, worked, and worshipped here, surrounded by desert. Its location was intentional. Close enough to Aswan for supplies, but far enough for seclusion. The walls protected the monks from raids and sandstorms, and the thick, simple architecture kept the inside cool during scorching summers. At its peak, the monastery had 2 floors, a basilica with carved niches and painted icons, a kitchen, storerooms, and small cells where the monks lived in silence. What made this place stand out wasn't just its size, but its endurance. It remained active for centuries, even during periods of political upheaval and shifting control. Pilgrims came here. So did travelers heading into Nubia, who often stopped to rest and pray before continuing south. By the 13th century, the monastery was abandoned, possibly due to water shortages or repeated attacks. But its walls remained. And unlike many ancient Christian sites, St. Simeon wasn't built over, buried, or repurposed. It was left in the sun and wind, slowly worn, but never erased. Today, it's one of the best preserved examples of early Christian monastic life in Egypt. Just beyond the southern edge of Aswan lies a place many visitors overlook, the Islamic Cemetery. At first, it may seem like just another burial ground. Scattered domes, weathered tombs, narrow footpaths winding through dust. But this site carries centuries of memory and marks the final chapter in the long timeline of the Nubian monuments. The cemetery has been in use since the medieval period, with some tombs dating back to the 9th or 10th century. Over time, it became the resting place for generations of Muslim families, scholars, and religious figures from the Aswan region. What makes this site significant isn't just its age, but its continuity. While temples and quarries reflect Egypt's ancient past, the Islamic cemetery links that history to more recent layers of belief and tradition. Some of the tombs bear inscriptions in Arabic. Others are unmarked, worn down by wind and time. Walking through, it's clear this wasn't planned as a tourist site. The cemetery's inclusion in the UNESCO listing wasn't about grandeur. It was about context. This site helps tell a broader story, how Aswan evolved, how cultures shifted, and how the sacred remained central through every era. Today, the Islamic cemetery is still used by local families. And in the bigger picture of the Nubian monuments, it closes the arc, from temples carved for immortality to graves made for remembrance. The Nubian monuments from Abu Simbel to Philae were inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1979. The site was recognized based on 3 criteria, each pointing to a different aspect of its value. Criterion number 1 represents human creative genius. Monuments like Abu Simbel and Philae stand out for their monumental scale and artistic mastery, featuring colossal statues and intricately carved decorations. Criterion number 3, testament to cultural tradition. These sites capture the evolving Nubian cultural expressions shaped by ancient Egyptian influence, with roots stretching from the New Kingdom through Greco-Roman times. Criterion number 6, direct historical associations. Philae marks the survival of ancient Egyptian religion under Ptolemaic and Roman rule. Its later Christian conversion adds another layer of spiritual significance. These 3 criteria highlight both the artistic excellence of the monuments and their role as witnesses to cultural continuity across ancient pharaohs, Roman emperors, and early Christian communities. The rescue of the Nubian monuments was one of the largest international collaborations in the history of archaeology, and Egypt made sure to acknowledge the countries that played a key role. As a gesture of gratitude, 4 temples were donated to nations that went beyond basic support, offering not just funding, but also engineers, equipment, and sustained technical cooperation. Spain provided both financial and logistical support, particularly during the relocation of temples like Dhaka and Maharaka. Egypt offered the Temple of Debod to Spain. It was dismantled, shipped to Madrid, and reconstructed stone by stone, where it still stands in the Parque del Oeste. The United States gave extensive financial backing and conservation expertise. In thanks, Egypt donated the Temple of Dendur, now housed inside a gallery at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Italy sent technical teams and equipment and helped coordinate site documentation, especially around Philae and Kalabsha. As recognition, the Temple of Alesia was gifted to Italy and installed in the Museo Egizio in Turin. The Netherlands also contributed funding and scientific consultation. In 1979, they received the Temple of Tafé, now reconstructed in the Rijksmuseum van Oudheden in Leiden. These were not symbolic gifts. Each temple was an authentic, ancient structure, dismantled in Nubia, transported across continents, and entrusted to new hosts. They became part of the story too, not of Egypt's past, but of how the world chose to protect it. From Abu Simbel to Philae, from carved tombs to forgotten monasteries, the Nubian monuments tell a story that spans empires, religions, and rescue missions. Each site adds a piece to a puzzle that nearly disappeared beneath the water and was saved just in time. But beyond the temples and stone walls, what makes this place unforgettable is the idea behind it. That heritage isn't just local. It belongs to everyone. Have you ever walked through one of these sites? Or is it still on your list? Share what fascinates you most. The architecture, the history, the rescue story. What would you have saved? And what part still stays with you? Let's talk in the comments.